بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وبعد. The major theme of the Quran that we are going to talk about now is not a usual theme that people address. I thought though it's important for us to discuss and for me to introduce perhaps so that we are aware of that theme of the Quran and internalize it and think about it and study it further, obviously. It is the theme of hujaj or barahin or proofs. How does the Quran prove something? What is the logic? What is the reasoning methodology of the Quran? And this is very important because oftentimes we lack this kind of thinking and we oftentimes follow reasoning methodologies that are false, or what we call in philosophical language logical fallacies. The Quran also addresses a number of those and is telling us what is a logical fallacy versus what is the sound reasoning and the proper reasoning. And it's very important because the lack of reasoning and the lack of the reference to the logic of the Quran causes intellectual problems sometimes. And the intellectual problems are not just philosophical, they have an impact on how people think and therefore how people act and react to what they see. And it's very important for us to be aware of that theme. How to establish truth? What kind of reasoning do you follow? Usually we follow the causal reasoning, or in the Quran it's the word al-asbab or as-sabab. These are Quranic words. Reason or a cause is something that impacts reality and causes reality to change. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us a lot about that in the Quran. How the water He sends so that the plants could happen. And He says, فَأَخْرَجْنَا بِهِ, with the water, not in parallel to the water, because some Muslim philosophers from the Ash'ari school anyway, they thought that causality doesn't exist and that it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who brings forth everything and causes are separate from impacts. And this is a kind of philosophical theory that is not really supported by the Quran. Because the Quran says bihi, not ma'ahu. It says with it we bring forth plantation. The fire does cause the burning, and so forth. But the Quran though balances the causality thinking with what perhaps is called in English the teleological thinking, or the teleology logic, or the purpose-based, the purposefulness. So there is nothing in the Quran that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us is a reason for something unless He tells us the purpose of that reasoning. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the water so that plantations could grow, so that you could have benefits, and so that you could thank Allah, and so that لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ, so that you might remember the sequence of events that brought you to where you are, and so forth. So you can say that reality in the Quran is logically driven by two forces: the force of causes from the past and the force of purpose in the future. And obviously people who are busy with logical philosophy, they debate that teleology versus causality. And now of course the status quo today is causality really in science and so forth. But if we think about the universal laws that we discussed before, and these are purposes, they are ends, these major laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe with are also ends that the universe is pushed towards. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also in the logic of the Quran is teaching us what we call in today's logical language multidimensionality of logic. Logic is not just linear cause and effect, but there are multiple causes and multiple effects. And this multidimensionality is very important when you look at anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us about the historical events, for example, not just in a cause and effect manner, but the different dimensions of the historical event, the different dimensions of the natural event, so that when we look at an event, we analyze it comprehensively, and we do not think linearly. The linear thinking is a very simplistic thinking that, yes, you can read in the Quran, but the reflection of the logic upon the logic of the Quran would show you the multidimensionality we're talking about. The Quran, through multidimensionality, balances those contradictions that philosophers always argue between universality and particularism, between, again, causality and teleology, between all of these contradictory views and interpretations of the logical structure of the universe, that the Quran beautifully integrates all in a holistic approach and an integrative approach. The logical relationships in the Quran are networks rather than lines. Every meaning, every story, every personality, every event in nature or socially is connected to a network of events and a network of meanings. The structure of the logical framework of the Quran is really a network structure. And perhaps this is impacted by how networks are very powerful in today's logical structures. Could be so, and no view, a human view like this view of myself doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from somewhere, from a background of science and philosophy and so forth that we do in our time. But the networks relations in the Quran are very important. And this is very important so that we sophisticate our interpretation a little bit. It's not just one verse or half a verse or this word or that word that will bring that rule or that understanding. It is actually all the verses that are related. And if you reflect deeply, you will find that all the Quran is related to any question that you mention because of this web of meanings that are connected and interconnected. It's very important in the logical framework of reasoning. The Quran also teaches us about the logical fallacies so that we avoid them in our lives and that we understand them when we see them. And they are usually taught through the stories of the tyrants in human history and how they used these fallacies for power and for authority that they claim falsely based on the false logic or the false claims. A false causality, for example, when the pharaohs accused, and the pharaoh and his people accused Musa sallallahu alaihi wasallam of being the reason behind all the calamities that had befallen us. But the calamities had befallen them because of their injustice and because of killing innocent children and because of the corruption on earth that Allah told us about. It's not because of Musa. Musa came to change that reality, but they do this false causality fallacy. Personal attack. Again, Musa and the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh told him, you don't even speak in our accent. You cannot even speak well as the others who speak. And that is a personal attack through which the Pharaoh tried to establish a certain logic, a certain authority. Therefore, your message is not true, or therefore you are a liar, and so forth. But this is not a proper reasoning, because personal attacks do not change the true arguments. Fame of ideas, it's a fallacy that the Quran tells us in many contexts, in which people say, because our forefathers didn't believe in that, then it's false. Because most people do not believe in it and do not see it this way, then it is false, or it is a conspiracy, or it's any of that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that most people do not believe. Most people are not true in faith. And most people will lead you astray if you follow them, and so forth. And therefore, the majority here is a good idea, perhaps, in politics in order to make some choice of a leadership without conflicts in the society. But the truth is not a democratic practice. The truth is according to the argument and the logic of the argument. And the logic of the argument has to be true and has to be coming out of faith in the core of it, so that it's true, and not in the fame of ideas kind of logic, how many likes and how many this and how many views. Unfortunately, social media had caused us a lot of support for the fallacy of the fame of ideas, but the fame of ideas are not a proof, is not a proof in terms of the logical truth in the Quran. Power of authority as well is another fallacy, that people, because of the authority places they have, they think that what they speak is truth, or they claim that what they speak is truth. But the power of authority is another fallacy, because truth could come from people who have no authority, people who have no wealth, for example, and so forth. But they bring truth because they have a logical argument that is based on truth. And the core of all truths is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the arguments that He made in the Quran are the true arguments upon which we should evaluate other arguments. Otherwise, we are talking about fallacies. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us and forgive us. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.